What if the house you grew up in wasn't built for you, but was built to trap you? The thought had crossed David's mind only once before, as a joke in a conversation with a friend during his college years. But now, standing at the edge of the driveway, staring at the looming structure of his childhood home, the words felt terrifyingly literal. The house had always been imposing, even as a child, its sharp corners cutting against the horizon, windows like watchful eyes following him wherever he ran. But now, in the pallid light of early evening, it looked almost alive, as if it had waited for him, knowing he would eventually return. The air smelled faintly of rotten old wood. Leaves rustled across the long, crooked driveway, whispering against his shoes like the hushed secrets of decades past. David's hands trembled slightly as he turned the key in the rusted lock, the familiar click sounding louder than he expected. The door opened with a groan, and a rush of stale air escaped, carrying with it the scent of dust, mildew, and something darker, something almost metallic. The house seemed to exhale at his arrival, welcoming him, or perhaps warning him. The inside had changed. At first, it seemed normal, the worn carpet, the faded wallpaper, the family portraits hanging crookedly on the walls. But as he stepped deeper, he noticed subtle differences. The hallway to the kitchen seemed longer than he remembered, stretching in a way that made him instinctively measure his steps. Doors that had once opened into bedrooms now led to blank walls. Windows appeared in places that defied memory or reason, showing glimpses of the outside that didn't match the yard he had just walked through. The angles were wrong. The house didn't just exist, it had rearranged itself. David's pulse quickened as he tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Maybe it was grief, maybe exhaustion, or the strange disorientation that comes with stepping into a home empty of its previous life. But then he heard it, a soft sound, like a floorboard creaking far above him, though the second floor had been boarded up after his parents died. A whisper of movement, deliberate and slow. He froze, straining his ears. The house was waiting, and somehow he knew it had been waiting for him. Every step forward felt wrong, as if the walls themselves shifted when he wasn't looking. The familiar living room, the room where he had celebrated birthdays, fought with siblings, and listened to his mother's lullabies, now seemed impossibly vast. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, pooling in corners where corners had never been. And from the darkness came the faintest sound of a voice, echoing his own name. Not clearly, but elongated, almost seductive, pulling him deeper into the house. David stopped. His rational mind screamed that it was impossible, that the house couldn't change, couldn't wait. Yet his instincts, honed over a lifetime of childhood familiarity, told him otherwise. Every instinct, every memory, was being manipulated, stretched, and pulled by the very walls that had once sheltered him. The house had grown, transformed, and now it loomed over him like a predator, patient and knowing. A door ahead of him appeared suddenly, one that hadn't existed the last time he visited. It was black, smooth, and unmarked. David felt an inexplicable compulsion to open it. His fingers brushed the handle, cold and metallic, and a shiver ran through him. What lay beyond could be a room, a hallway, or something else entirely. The air on the other side seemed to hum, vibrating faintly against his skin. He pulled the door open, and the house exhaled again, a slow, deep groan that echoed in his chest. Beyond the door, the hallway twisted impossibly, folding back on itself like a Mobius strip. Each turn he took led him to rooms he didn't recognize but that felt deeply familiar, his own childhood bedroom, the kitchen where he'd eaten his first burnt toast, the attic filled with dust and forgotten toys. And yet, none of it was exactly as he remembered. He realized with a sinking certainty that the house was not a home. It was a maze. It was alive. And it was waiting. From somewhere deep within, a voice whispered again, this time sharper, closer. David, it said, stretching the syllables. You can't leave. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The house wasn't just waiting. It had a purpose. And that purpose, he now realized, was him. David's feet moved almost on their own, drawn deeper into the twisting hallway. Each step felt heavier than the last, the air thick with the scent of old wood and something acrid, like smoke that had never burned but lingered as a memory. He tried to keep count of his turns, to map the rooms in his mind, but it was futile. The walls shifted subtly whenever he wasn't looking. A door that had been to his left now appeared on the right, and a staircase leading up curved impossibly into the ceiling, defying reason and gravity. The house wasn't merely alive, it was rewriting itself around him, anticipating his movements, shaping a labyrinth he could never hope to escape. As he turned another corner, a faint sound caught his attention. At first, he thought it was wind, or the house settling, but the rhythm was too deliberate. Footsteps. Soft, measured, following him. He froze, heart hammering, and pressed himself against the wall, listening. There was a pause, then a shuffle, then silence. The house seemed to breathe around him, the floorboards groaning under invisible weight. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Whoever, or whatever, was here, it didn't want him to feel safe for even a second. David tried to call out, his voice echoing strangely in the corridor, warped as though the walls themselves were mocking him. "Hello? Is anyone here?" His words were swallowed almost immediately by the impossible geometry, leaving only an eerie silence. Then came the whisper again, softer this time, like a memory brushing against his consciousness. "David, don't go." He spun, searching, but the corridor was empty. The doorways stared back at him like hollow eyes, revealing glimpses of rooms that shouldn't exist, his old playroom, the basement where he had once built a fort, the attic filled with forgotten relics. And in each space, shadows moved just beyond his vision, curling and stretching in ways that made his stomach lurch. He tried to rationalize it, to ground himself in reality. Perhaps grief had twisted his memories, perhaps the house had decayed in ways he didn't understand. But logic faltered the moment he reached the kitchen. What had once been a small, cramped space now stretched endlessly in both directions, counters multiplying, cupboards folding into corners that should have been walls. And on the counter, something glimmered, a photograph of his parents, smiling, untouched by age, though he knew they had been gone for months. The sight made his stomach churn, a cold dread spreading through him. The house wasn't just a maze, it was a mirror, reflecting memories, manipulating them, twisting them to trap him further. He backed away, panic clawing at his chest, and stumbled into another room. It was the living room, but wrong. The fireplace loomed impossibly high, the ceiling curling inward like a wave frozen in time. Shadows pooled in corners that had never existed, writhing with faint whispers. And then he heard it, a soft, low chuckle. Not human, but eerily familiar, carrying the timbre of his father's voice. "You've come home, David," it said. The words didn't echo, they pressed directly against his mind, as if the house itself was speaking through his memories, calling him further in, daring him to resist. He ran, or thought he ran, but the floor seemed to stretch beneath him, taking longer to reach the next door than any step should have allowed. The house warped around him with every movement. A hallway that should have led to the front door twisted into the stairwell, then into the attic, then into a narrow crawlspace that forced him to stoop. He felt the walls pressing in, breathing around him, as if the house were aware of his fear and feeding off it. And then he saw it, a door at the very end of the warped corridor, black and unadorned. Something about it felt final. Compulsion overtook him, he had to open it. The air shimmered before the door, heavy, alive, and when he touched the handle, a jolt ran through him, cold as ice and sharp as a knife. The door opened slowly, groaning in protest, revealing a vast, impossibly deep space beyond. It was dark, but faint glimmers of light hinted at movement, like fireflies, or eyes. And from that darkness came a whisper that made him stagger back, cold sweat soaking his shirt. "David, we've been waiting for you." His knees buckled. The house wasn't just a building. It was a predator. And he was finally in the part it had designed for him, its final chamber, the place where it had been preparing to trap him, to make him never leave again. David pressed his back against the wall, staring into the dark expanse beyond the black door. The air felt alive, vibrating faintly as if the house itself were breathing, and the whispering grew louder, multiple voices now, overlapping, echoing his own name in tones both pleading and mocking. Each syllable clawed at his mind, dredging memories he had long buried, his mother calling him for dinner, his father laughing at a joke he couldn't quite remember, his childhood dog whining at the front door. But with each memory came a twisting shadow, stretching the faces, elongating the limbs, making them grotesque. The house was pulling at his mind, trying to rewrite reality, to convince him that the past had never ended. He forced himself forward, stepping through the doorway, and the floor beneath him shifted as though it were liquid. Each step stretched unnaturally, making him feel as if he were walking through syrup, every movement a struggle. The walls around him bent inward and outward with each blink, creating hallways that led nowhere or everywhere. Doors appeared on all sides, some opening into rooms he remembered fondly, others into places that should not exist, rooms filled with furniture that seemed to be alive, crawling across the floor, twisting toward him, waiting for a mistake. The air smelled of smoke and old earth, a combination that made his stomach churn, and he realized he could no longer tell which way was up. A staircase emerged suddenly, curling in a spiral that defied geometry, leading upward but simultaneously downward, its steps multiplying as he approached. David climbed cautiously, hands gripping the warped railing, the wood trembling under his touch. Behind him, the whispering voices intensified, now distinctly male and female, some familiar, some alien, all insisting, cajoling, threatening, "Stay, stay, never leave." The sound wasn't just auditory, it pressed against his bones, filled his lungs, invaded his thoughts, making it almost impossible to think clearly. Every instinct screamed to flee, but every instinct was trapped, as if the house had anticipated his fear and weaponized it. At the top of the staircase, he found a room that should have been his old bedroom, yet it was enormous, stretching endlessly in every direction. Shadows danced along the walls, creating the illusion of people standing just beyond his reach. He stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind him, though he had not touched it. Panic rose in his chest. The windows were black mirrors now, reflecting not the outside world but twisted versions of himself, David as a child, David as an old man, David as something unrecognizable, his face contorted in fear and despair. The house was not just trapping him, it was studying him, reshaping him, folding him into its labyrinthine mind. A soft, almost melodic voice floated through the room, one he did not recognize immediately. "You shouldn't have come back," it said. It was feminine, calm, almost comforting, yet every word carried an undercurrent of menace. The walls seemed to pulse in time with the voice, contracting and expanding like a living organism. David realized he had been wrong to think the house was simply a building. It was a predator, and he was the prey it had been preparing for decades, waiting patiently until he returned, guided by grief, curiosity, and the compulsion of memory. David's breathing grew ragged. He stumbled backward, his hand hitting a table that wasn't there moments before. The wood was sticky with a dark substance, and as he touched it, a vision flashed before his eyes, himself, trapped, forever wandering through hallways that had no end, screaming, reaching for doors that led nowhere. He shook his head violently, trying to dispel the image, but the house had begun to merge with his mind. Every memory, every fear, every hope was a tool, and it was using them all to guide him deeper, to ensure he could never leave. Then, from the corner of the room, a door appeared, one he did not remember ever existing. It was smaller, lower to the ground, almost hidden, and yet the pull toward it was irresistible. David knew instinctively that this door led to the heart of the house, the place it had been waiting to show him all along. But as he approached, the shadows solidified, forming figures that mirrored his family, his friends, even strangers he had never met. They reached for him with twisted smiles, their mouths moving but producing no sound, their eyes hollow yet burning with expectation. The house was testing him, daring him to step forward, daring him to claim the path it had prepared for him. With a deep, trembling breath, David grasped the doorknob. The room around him shivered, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The whispering voices converged into a single, deafening command. "Come, or never leave." David turned the knob, feeling a cold surge of air, and pushed the door open. Beyond lay darkness that seemed alive, a void that pulled at his mind, promising both revelation and oblivion. And as he stepped inside, he realized fully, the house had not just been waiting for him, it had been growing, learning, and planning. And now, it was finally ready. David's foot crossed the threshold into the darkness, and the air seemed to pull at him like thick liquid, each step slower than it should have been, each movement a struggle against an unseen force. The void beyond the door wasn't empty, it was alive with whispers, shadows, and pulses of light that hinted at forms just out of reach. His breath came in shallow gasps as the realization hit him. He had entered the house's heart, the central core where it stored memories, fears, and desires, twisting them into weapons against him. Every thought, every recollection he had ever held, was being used to draw him further in, to ensure he could never leave. The floor beneath him shifted suddenly, dropping and rising in impossible angles. He stumbled, catching himself on walls that weren't really there moments before, their surfaces soft and pulsing like skin. The hallway stretched into infinity, then folded back on itself in a dizzying spiral. Rooms he had thought were familiar appeared to his left and right, each one a grotesque echo of his life. His old bedroom, now larger than the living room, the kitchen, cluttered with utensils that moved of their own accord, a bathroom where the mirror reflected not him, but a hollow-eyed version of himself screaming silently. The house was no longer just a trap, it was a predator, experimenting with him, testing how far it could manipulate his mind before he broke. A sudden voice broke the suffocating silence. It was soft, whispering, carrying the weight of familiarity. David, it was his mother's voice. You shouldn't be here. He froze. His heart twisted painfully in his chest. The voice was sweet, soothing, yet laced with menace. The floor shifted beneath him again, tilting slightly as if the house itself was laughing at his hesitation. Shadows coalesced around the edges of the room, forming figures of people he once knew, friends, family, even strangers he had only met briefly. They beckoned him forward, arms outstretched, their eyes hollow but glowing faintly with expectation. He recoiled, realizing the house was using memories to manipulate him, shaping his nostalgia and fear into chains he could not see. The next room opened suddenly, bathed in an eerie, pale light that seemed to pulse with a heartbeat. In the center stood a chair, ordinary, yet impossibly large, as if built for a giant. As he approached, the walls around him twisted, molding into the shape of a vast auditorium. Shadows filled the rows of seats, murmuring incoherently, their voices merging into a single, oppressive hum that pressed against his chest. He stumbled back, trying to escape, but the room stretched and folded, the exits vanishing as quickly as they appeared. Every instinct screamed that he had to leave, but the house had learned his pattern, anticipating his flight and turning it into yet another trap. A door appeared high above him on the far wall, impossibly distant. Light leaked from its edges, warm and inviting, a false promise of escape. David climbed the warped floorboards toward it, each step taking exponentially longer, each plank bending and twisting beneath his weight. Behind him, the shadows moved faster now, the whispering voices merging into a chorus, stay, come back, never leave. It was not merely the house speaking, it was something within the house, a consciousness older than his understanding, aware of every memory, every fear, every desire. It wasn't trying to scare him, it was trying to consume him, fold him into its endless halls, and rewrite reality around him. He reached the door finally, his hands trembling as he touched the knob. A sudden gust of wind slammed into him, forcing him to stagger. The shadows surged forward, solidifying into shapes that were part human, part nightmare, reaching out with twisted limbs that seemed to pierce the very air. The whispers became screams, echoing off the walls, echoing inside his mind. You belong to us, you will never leave. David's vision blurred, his stomach twisted, and yet some small fragment of determination held him upright. He had to push forward. He had to see what lay beyond. With a trembling breath, he turned the knob and pushed. The door opened into a space that seemed impossibly vast, a void of darkness broken by the faintest glimmers of light, like stars suspended in black velvet. And at the center, he saw something that made his blood run cold, the house's core, a pulsating mass of shadows and light, writhing as if alive, feeding on his fear, his memories, and his very essence. The whispers converged into a single, commanding voice. David, you were made for this place. And now, you cannot leave. His chest tightened, his legs refused to move, and the house exhaled around him, a deep, resonant sound that shook the floor and walls. He realized, with a terror that made him almost collapse, that the house had not only been waiting for him, it had been preparing him, shaping him, guiding him to this moment. And in this infinite, shifting heart, the choice was no longer his. David stumbled backward, his gaze locked on the pulsating heart of the house. Shadows writhed around it like living smoke, curling and twisting in patterns that made his stomach lurch. The whispers had merged into a single, deafening hum, vibrating inside his skull, threading through his thoughts, twisting his memories. Every corner of the room seemed to pulse in time with the house's breathing, every floorboard shifting beneath him. He realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that the house wasn't just alive, it was aware, sentient, and it wanted him entirely. He turned to run, but the door behind him vanished. The walls warped in impossible angles, stretching outward and collapsing inward simultaneously. Hallways that had existed moments before now led only to walls or to rooms that should not exist. One hallway stretched endlessly, lined with mirrors reflecting his every movement, but not as he truly was. Each reflection was subtly wrong, longer limbs, distorted features, eyes that followed him with a sentient, hungry intelligence. He staggered back, tripping over a step that appeared only under his feet, landing on a floor that seemed to breathe, sinking slightly as if it could swallow him whole. A voice whispered directly into his mind this time, soft, insistent, familiar yet alien, "You cannot leave, David. You belong here." He spun in place, searching for the source, but the room offered nothing tangible, just darkness and the flicker of shapes that darted at the edges of his vision. Panic rose in his chest, hot and suffocating. He could feel the house probing, testing his fears, learning how to manipulate him further. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, then folded down toward him, the walls narrowing, the floor tilting, creating the sensation that he was trapped inside a living coffin. Desperate, he darted into the nearest room, a distorted version of his childhood bedroom. The familiar bed, posters, and toys were all there, but twisted, elongated, their angles wrong, the colors unnaturally vivid, almost glowing. His old desk drawer opened on its own, revealing photographs of himself at different ages, but in each picture, his eyes were black voids. He recoiled, his mind screaming for escape, but the room was changing as he watched. The walls seemed to breathe, exhaling whispers that sounded like his own voice, repeating his fears back to him. "You cannot leave, you cannot leave." David's hands shook as he stumbled toward the window, hoping for a glimpse of the outside, any anchor to reality. But the glass reflected nothing beyond darkness. Beyond the reflection, he thought he saw a field, then a forest, then a city skyline, but each view shifted as he blinked, impossible landscapes that defied logic. He realized the house was creating illusions, bending reality to confuse him, to make him doubt his own senses, to make him pliable, compliant, trapped. From behind, a floorboard creaked. David whirled, but the hallway he had just come from no longer existed. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room, forming indistinct shapes that edged toward him with slow, deliberate intent. He backed away, only to find that the door he had entered through was now a solid wall, smooth and unyielding. A whisper curled around his ear, intimate, chilling, "Step forward, David, or stay forever." The house was not just a maze, it was a predator, and he was the prey. In a sudden burst of clarity, David realized the truth. The house wasn't just waiting for him, it had shaped itself around him, each hallway, each room, each shifting shadow created in anticipation of his return. It knew him better than he knew himself. Every memory, every fear, every moment of vulnerability had been catalogued, used to manipulate him, guiding him to this point. And now, it was ready to claim him fully, folding his reality into its eternal, impossible architecture. A low rumble shook the room, the walls vibrating in tandem with the house's pulse. The shadows solidified further, forming grotesque approximations of his parents, their faces stretched into unnatural smiles. They reached for him, silent, expectant, urging him to submit. David's chest heaved with terror, his mind racing for any solution, any escape. But he knew instinctively, this was no ordinary house, no ordinary trap. This was a predator that had waited decades, perfecting every nuance of his fear, every distortion of his perception. He forced himself to breathe, to think, to move, but every instinct, every motion, seemed anticipated. The house shifted beneath him, corridors bending, rooms stretching, floors tilting. And from the darkness ahead, a door appeared, impossibly small and low, radiating a faint, eerie light. David felt it pull him, a compulsion deeper than curiosity, something ancient, patient, promising both revelation and doom. He knew the house had chosen this moment for him, and stepping through that door was both the only option and the ultimate risk. With trembling hands, he reached for the handle, the shadows closing in, whispering, urging, mocking. And as he turned the knob, the house exhaled, a sound that echoed through his bones, a vibration that promised both terror and inevitability. He pushed the door open, stepping into darkness that seemed to devour the world around him, and understood fully, the house had been waiting for him all along. David stepped through the low, glowing doorway, and the air immediately thickened, pressing against his skin, making every breath feel like inhaling lead. Darkness enveloped him, yet it was alive, pulsing, writhing, whispering his name with voices that carried the weight of every memory he had ever tried to forget. The floor beneath him shifted subtly, bending and undulating like a living thing, each step threatening to unbalance him. He realized the house no longer needed walls or ceilings, it was manifesting spaces directly around his perception, shaping reality itself to toy with him. Ahead, a corridor materialized, lined with doors of every size and shape. Some were familiar, his childhood bedroom, the kitchen where he had once burned toast, the attic filled with forgotten toys. Others were impossible, angled wrong, suspended in midair, some half open, some disappearing when he tried to focus. He understood with a cold clarity that each door represented a choice, a test. Step through one, and he might encounter memories twisted into nightmares. Step through another, and he might confront fears he had buried deep within his psyche. The house wasn't just a building, it was a gauntlet designed specifically for him. A soft, melodic voice echoed from a nearby doorway, seductive and familiar, his mother, singing a lullaby he hadn't heard in decades. David's knees buckled. The tune should have comforted him, yet it made his skin crawl, each note vibrating with a malevolent undertone. He turned to flee, only to find the corridor had shifted again, extending farther than physically possible, doors multiplying on either side, each whispering in his own voice, "You cannot leave, you belong here." Panic surged, and he stumbled forward, desperately trying to find an exit that didn't exist. One door creaked open before him, revealing a room bathed in an unnatural, golden light. Inside, the space was both familiar and alien. His childhood home, perfectly intact, yet stretched, elongated, warped. Furniture moved subtly, chairs and tables repositioning themselves as he watched. On the mantel, photographs of his family shimmered, their smiles exaggerated, faces twisting into grotesque parodies of themselves. The room itself seemed alive, breathing, watching, waiting. A figure appeared, his father, or a version of him, eyes hollow and black, reaching toward David with impossibly long arms. "You should have stayed away," it whispered, voice layered with menace and sorrow. David recoiled, heart pounding, but the room shifted immediately. Walls bent inward, the floor rose and fell, doors disappeared and reappeared. He realized with growing horror that the house wasn't merely manipulating space, it was manipulating his perception, his very understanding of reality. Shadows that had been fixed now moved independently, crawling across walls, pooling in corners, whispering promises and threats in a language that was simultaneously familiar and alien. Each step he took was anticipated, each turn calculated, each heartbeat measured and used against him. Desperate, David ran into another corridor, the walls closing slightly behind him, narrowing with subtle pressure. Shadows converged at the periphery of his vision, forming human shapes, then dissolving into smoke as he turned to look directly. The voices multiplied, layering his own memories against fragments of nightmares he could not recall ever having, creating a sensory overload that left him staggered, nauseated, and panicked. The house wasn't just a trap, it was a sentient predator, feeding on fear, anticipation, and memory, growing stronger with each step he took. Ahead, a staircase spiraled impossibly upward. Its steps were uneven, each plank seeming alive, moving subtly beneath his feet as though testing his balance. He ascended cautiously, aware that a single misstep could plunge him into another layer of the house's maze. From the shadows above, whispers of encouragement and warning intertwined, both coaxing and threatening him. As he climbed, he realized the house was creating his own history against him, constructing a narrative in which he was always late, always behind, always trapped. At the top of the staircase, he emerged into a vast room filled with mirrors. Each reflected version of himself moved independently, some smiling, some screaming, some gesturing him forward, others beckoning him back. The whispers now became a cacophony of voices, layered and overlapping, calling his name, repeating every regret, every mistake, every fear. His own reflection in the central mirror began to shift and move before him, morphing into an older, twisted version of himself, exhausted, fearful, trapped, and he understood fully. The house wanted to replace his reality with its own, folding his identity into its labyrinth, erasing who he truly was. David staggered back, breath ragged, chest pounding, mind fraying at the edges. The house pulsed around him, alive with anticipation, aware that he understood its intent. And as the whispers coalesced into a single, commanding voice, he felt it pressing directly against his mind. David, you cannot leave. You belong to the house now. David staggered backward from the mirrors, his reflection multiplying and twisting with every blink. Each version of himself seemed to have a mind of its own, some screaming silently, some smiling with a knowing malice that made his stomach turn. The house was no longer merely manipulating the physical world, it had begun to invade his mind directly, twisting perception and memory until he could no longer trust what he saw or felt. Shadows stretched across the floor, reaching for him with elongated, clawed fingers, and the whispering voices became a chorus of accusations, reminders of every regret he had ever carried. You cannot leave, you belong here. He turned to flee, heart hammering, and the mirrors rippled like liquid, swallowing parts of the room and revealing spaces that had never existed before. One mirror reflected a hallway filled with smoke, another a garden where the trees bent unnaturally toward him, yet another a staircase spiraling downward into darkness. The house was layering realities, folding multiple dimensions into his awareness, each one designed to disorient, terrify, and trap him. Every instinct screamed that he was being toyed with, hunted, and studied by something that had waited decades for this moment. The floor beneath him shuddered, and a wall on his left dissolved, revealing a long corridor lined with doors that pulsed faintly like beating hearts. Some doors were ajar, offering glimpses of scenes he recognized, moments from his childhood, snapshots of memories, but each one was warped, twisted, horrific. In one, his mother smiled at him with eyes black as coal, in another, his father's face split open in a silent scream. The house was forcing him to relive his past, but in forms distorted beyond comprehension. He realized with growing horror that it was feeding on his emotions, fear, guilt, nostalgia, every feeling a tool to trap him further. As he ran down the corridor, the ceiling began to bend, dipping low, then rising impossibly high, creating a vertigo-inducing tunnel that seemed to stretch forever. The walls shifted again, folding into themselves, and he felt a pressure on his chest as if the house itself were squeezing him, testing his resolve. The whispers intensified, now indistinguishable from the thoughts in his own mind. You cannot escape, you cannot resist, you belong to us. He pressed forward, every step a battle against both the house's manipulation and the terror clawing at his sanity. A door suddenly appeared at the end of the hallway, smaller than the others, glowing faintly with a pale, unnatural light. Compulsion overtook him. He knew instinctively that it led to the heart of the house, the chamber it had been preparing for him, the place where it would claim him fully. Yet as he approached, the walls around him warped violently, forming shapes, human, animal, and impossible combinations, that lunged toward him, only to dissolve into smoke as he dodged. Each shadow seemed aware of him, predicting his moves, adapting, learning, forcing him to navigate the corridor as if it were a living maze designed specifically to break his mind. David's breath came in ragged gasps, sweat streaming down his face, but he pushed forward, compelled by a mix of fear, desperation, and the primal urge to survive. He reached the door at last, heart pounding, hands trembling as he turned the knob. The house shuddered as if it sensed his intent, the floor quaking beneath him. A chorus of whispers rose to a deafening pitch, layered with voices from his past, friends, family, strangers, all urging him toward submission, toward surrender. Yet a flicker of defiance surged within him. He would not give in. Not yet. With a trembling breath, David stepped through the doorway. The room beyond was vast, impossibly high, filled with shadows and glimmers of light that danced like fireflies. At the center pulsed a massive, amorphous shape, black and writhing, alive with intent. The house's voice, now singular, clear, and omnipresent, reverberated inside his mind. David, you have come willingly. Now, the house will complete you. As the shadows stretched toward him, as the floor rippled beneath his feet, and as the whispering voices merged into a singular, suffocating presence, David realized the horrifying truth. The house had been building itself around him, learning him, shaping him, and now it was ready to consume his very essence. He could feel it reaching into his mind, pulling, reshaping, and he knew that escape, if possible at all, would require every ounce of courage, every fragment of his sanity, and a confrontation with the impossible heart of the house itself. David staggered forward into the vast, pulsating chamber, his legs trembling beneath him, every breath a struggle against the suffocating weight of the air. The shadows writhed across the walls like living ink, curling and stretching toward him, dissolving into shapes that were both familiar and horrifying. He realized that each shadow wasn't just an illusion, it carried fragments of his memories, twisted into grotesque forms that mocked him, tested him, and threatened to swallow him whole. A door appeared on the far side of the room, glowing faintly, but as he moved toward it, the floor beneath him warped, stretching like elastic, tilting him off balance, reminding him that the house dictated every movement, every possibility. The whispering voices rose to a crescendo, overlapping with his own thoughts, twisting memories of childhood, friends, and long-forgotten regrets into a maelstrom of sound. They called to him, coaxed him, and threatened him all at once. David, you cannot escape, we are inside you, forever. One voice, low and melodic, pierced through the cacophony. It sounded like his mother, comforting, yet carrying an undercurrent of malice that made his stomach twist. He clenched his fists, trying to block out the voices, trying to separate reality from illusion, but the house was everywhere at once. It had learned him completely, adapted to his fears, and now it was orchestrating them in a symphony of terror. The walls around him shifted suddenly, revealing hallways that hadn't existed moments before, each lined with doors that beckoned him with impossible promise. One opened into a field of sunlight, another into a childhood memory of a birthday party long past, yet another revealed a nightmarish void where his own screams echoed back at him. Each step he took drew him deeper, yet the house remained a predator, anticipating his actions, ensuring that no path led to freedom. As he approached a door shimmering with golden light, he felt a tug at his mind, a compulsion stronger than fear, more powerful than curiosity. The house wanted him, needed him, and it would bend every part of his being to claim him. From above, a staircase spiraled into impossible angles, its steps shifting like waves beneath his feet. David ascended cautiously, heart hammering, knowing that every second counted, every misstep could be fatal. As he climbed, the shadows solidified into figures, his parents, old friends, strangers, all staring at him with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. They whispered memories, regrets, and warnings, weaving them into the air, pressing against his mind. He realized with a shiver that the house was not merely physical, it had become a psychic entity, capable of invading thought, manipulating memory, and warping perception at will. Reaching the top of the staircase, David entered a room that seemed infinite, stretching endlessly in all directions. Mirrors lined the walls, each reflecting impossible versions of himself, some older, some younger, some screaming, some laughing with hollow eyes. A voice boomed from nowhere, singular and omnipotent, "You are mine, David. This house was made for you, shaped around your fears, your memories, your very soul." The mirrors shimmered, and from their surfaces, twisted forms lunged at him, pulling at his mind, pressing him to surrender. He felt the floor shift beneath him, the ceiling descend, and the walls fold in. He was trapped within the consciousness of the house itself, a living labyrinth designed to consume him entirely. David's panic threatened to overwhelm him, yet amid the terror, a spark of defiance flickered. He realized that if he gave in, if he allowed the house to claim him, he would be lost forever, not just physically, but mentally, spiritually, utterly. Mustering every ounce of courage, he pressed forward, ignoring the illusions, the whispers, the tugging shadows. He focused only on the faint glow ahead, the door that might lead him closer to understanding the true heart of the house and possibly, a path to escape. Every step felt like wading through molten fear, yet he moved steadily, determined not to surrender to the nightmare that had been waiting for him all these decades. At last, he reached the glowing door. It pulsed gently, beckoning, and David felt a momentary relief. But as he reached for the handle, the house reacted violently, the mirrors shattered around him, shadows surged forward, and the floor buckled beneath his weight. Whispers became screams, the air thick with sound, pressure, and the sensation of unseen hands gripping him. Yet, despite the onslaught, David understood the final truth: to survive, he would need to confront the house itself, to step fully into the darkness it had prepared, and face the impossible entity that had shaped every hallway, every door, every shadow to trap him. With a trembling breath, he turned the handle and pushed the door open, stepping into darkness so complete it seemed to devour the edges of his vision. And as he crossed the threshold, he realized fully, the house had been waiting, but now, the waiting was over. David stepped into the darkness beyond the glowing door, and it swallowed him like a living void. The air was heavy and wet, pressing against his skin, carrying the faint metallic tang of rust and earth. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, each one multiplying into dozens of sounds, some ahead, some behind, disorienting him completely. The shadows that had pursued him for hours, or had it been days, now moved independently, writhing in the air like smoke yet solid enough to brush against his arms. He realized with a chilling clarity that time itself had become fluid here, minutes could stretch into hours, hours into lifetimes. The house was no longer merely a structure, it was a world, and he had entered its very heart. Ahead, a faint, pulsating glow shimmered in the distance. David moved toward it, each step heavier than the last. The floor beneath him shifted subtly, rising and falling like waves, and the walls rippled, folding inward and outward, creating the sensation that he was walking through liquid reality. From the shadows, distorted voices whispered fragments of memories he hadn't recalled in years: childhood laughter, arguments, regrets, moments of shame and fear. Each memory pressed against him, a weight upon his chest, pulling at his mind. The house had learned him completely, every detail catalogued and now weaponized. As he drew closer to the glow, the air seemed to pulse with anticipation, vibrating in tune with his heartbeat. The floor tilted suddenly, and he stumbled, catching himself on a jagged edge that had appeared beneath his hand. The walls elongated, stretching impossibly upward, and shadows formed into indistinct figures, a parade of faces he recognized and feared: friends, family, strangers, all with hollow eyes and unnatural smiles. Their whispers merged into one continuous chant: "You belong here, you cannot escape, we are the house." David pressed forward, every nerve screaming in protest, every fiber of his being begging him to turn back, but there was no turning back. The glow intensified ahead, revealing a circular chamber larger than any room he had seen. Its floor was smooth, reflecting the light like liquid glass, and the walls spiraled upward into infinite darkness. At the center of the chamber floated a massive, pulsating mass of shadows and light, writhing and twisting as if alive. David felt it before he saw it, a presence so vast and oppressive that it seemed to press against his very soul. This was the core of the house, the entity that had waited decades for him, shaping every corridor, every door, every illusion to draw him to this moment. The shadows surrounding the chamber surged, forming humanoid shapes that lunged at him, only to dissolve before contact. The whispers intensified, becoming screams layered with voices he knew and ones he didn't, all converging into a single thought: "You cannot leave. You are ours." David's knees buckled, and he fell to the reflective floor, staring up at the writhing core. It pulsed with a rhythm that seemed to mimic his heartbeat, expanding and contracting, breathing with an intelligence that was terrifyingly aware of him. He realized, with a cold, sinking clarity, that the house did not merely trap bodies, it consumed minds, folding consciousness into its own labyrinthine design. He tried to retreat, but the walls of the chamber shifted, bending reality itself to block every escape. Hallways that had seemed distant now led directly back into the chamber, doors that had offered promise now slammed shut or twisted into impossible angles. The shadows whispered again, softly now, intimately, feeding on his fear. You thought you could resist, but this is who you are now. Every memory, every regret, every moment of weakness, the house catalogued and twisted, creating a personalized nightmare in which he was both actor and prisoner. David forced himself to stand, clutching his head as the whispers pressed against his thoughts. A strange clarity pierced through the panic. The house was not omnipotent, it was reactive, intelligent, but not invincible. If he could confront it, disrupt its patterns, refuse to play by its rules, he might find a way to escape. But the risk was unimaginable. One wrong move, one succumbing to fear, and he would be folded into the house's endless corridors, lost to eternity. Steeling himself, he took a deep breath and stepped fully into the chamber, toward the pulsating mass at its center. Every instinct screamed to turn back, yet something deeper, primal, urged him forward, the drive to survive, to reclaim his mind, to confront the impossible entity that had orchestrated his torment. As he reached out toward the writhing shadows, the house reacted violently, the chamber trembled, the floor rippled, and the reflections around him warped into faces he could barely recognize. Yet through the chaos, David knew this confrontation would decide everything. He was no longer merely running or hiding, the fight for his soul had begun. David stepped fully into the heart of the chamber, his senses assaulted by the undulating mass of shadows and flickering light before him. The air vibrated with a low hum, a resonance that felt like it penetrated his bones, syncing with his heartbeat, twisting his perception of time and space. The core pulsed rhythmically, almost sentiently, reacting to his presence, aware of his thoughts, his fears, his resolve. Every instinct screamed that retreat was impossible, that surrender would be immediate, yet a shard of defiance pushed him forward. He had come this far, and he would face whatever this house demanded. The shadows around the core began to coalesce into forms both familiar and horrifying. Figures from his past emerged, friends long forgotten, family members from memories he had tried to bury, strangers whose faces had lingered in fleeting moments. Each figure whispered secrets, fears, and regrets he had carried, shaping them into personal torment. "You cannot escape, you belong here," they murmured, echoing both within the chamber and inside his own mind. David felt his consciousness stretch, his memories bending under the pressure, yet he forced his gaze toward the writhing core. If he could anchor himself to a single thread of reality, perhaps he could resist being swallowed entirely. The core itself began to shift, morphing in shape and form. At times it resembled a towering labyrinth of impossible hallways, at others, a monstrous eye staring directly at him, pulsing with intelligence and hunger. The reflections on the chamber floor rippled with every movement, showing him distorted versions of himself, exhausted, terrified, twisted by the house's manipulations. He realized with cold clarity that the house's power stemmed not from walls or doors, but from its ability to manipulate perception, memory, and emotion simultaneously. It was a predator of mind and soul, and he was the intended prey. David's thoughts raced as the chamber seemed to stretch into infinity. Shadows reached for him, the whispers intensifying, layering with every memory he had ever held, turning nostalgia into terror. The house's will pressed against his mind, urging him to submit, to fold into its endless corridors. But in that instant, he recognized a pattern, small fluctuations in the shadows, tiny inconsistencies in the whispers, subtle distortions in the reflections. The house, despite its intelligence, was still bound by certain rules, by the reality it had twisted but not completely rewritten. David focused on these inconsistencies, using them as anchors, small footholds in a nightmare that threatened to consume him entirely. He moved closer to the core, each step a battle against vertigo and terror. The shadows surged, forming hands and faces, tugging at him, attempting to pull him into their chaotic mass. The whispers became screams, each one a fragment of his own voice repeating his deepest fears. "You are nothing, you cannot leave, you will become part of us." David shook his head, forcing clarity into his thoughts. He reminded himself who he was, what he wanted, and that the house, no matter how vast or intelligent, relied on his fear to function. With each step, he mentally resisted, pulling himself free from the psychic tendrils the house cast toward him. As he reached the center of the chamber, the core pulsed violently, reacting to his defiance. Light and shadow exploded outward in spiraling waves, threatening to disorient and crush him. Yet David pressed on, placing both hands against the quivering mass of darkness. It felt alive, like thick, viscous liquid, pulsing and writhing, probing his mind. He steeled himself and forced his consciousness into confrontation, refusing to yield. Every memory, every fear, every regret rose up around him, yet he faced them squarely, refusing to allow them to manipulate him further. The core shrieked, not with sound, but with a psychic resonance that threatened to tear his mind apart. Then, a sudden stillness. The core's pulsing slowed, the shadows withdrawing slightly, and a voice, singular and ancient, echoed through the chamber, "You have come willingly, but will you endure?" David's chest heaved, sweat dripping from his brow. He realized that this confrontation was not just physical or spatial, it was a battle of will, a struggle for dominance over his own perception. And in that instant, he understood the stakes. If he faltered now, he would be folded into the house's consciousness forever, his identity erased, his reality rewritten. With trembling determination, he tightened his focus, anchoring himself to the single truth he had discovered amid the chaos: the house could shape reality, twist perception, and manipulate memory, but it could not control the strength of his will if he refused to surrender. With that realization, he prepared to confront the core fully, to challenge the impossible entity that had waited decades for him. The chamber trembled around David, shadows writhing like living serpents, whispers erupting into a deafening chorus that pierced the very core of his mind. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing against him with a suffocating weight that made every breath a struggle. The core pulsed violently, a monstrous heartbeat that resonated through the reflective floor, walls, and ceiling, shaking the chamber as if the house itself were alive, aware, and enraged by his defiance. David's hands were still pressed against the writhing mass, and for the first time, he felt its consciousness probing his mind directly, digging into his memories, twisting them, testing his limits. Images of his childhood flooded him, the house as it had once been, the rooms he had known, the laughter, the warmth, but all corrupted, distorted into grotesque parodies. His parents' faces twisted into snarls, familiar friends became shadows with hollow, accusing eyes. The house had not only studied his fears, it had learned how to manifest them in tangible forms, weaponizing every fragment of memory. The whispers now carried intent, each syllable a thread tugging at his sanity. "You belong to us, forever, surrender." Panic clawed at his chest, yet in the depths of terror, a spark of determination ignited. David realized the battle was not physical, it was a war of wills. The house was attempting to fold him entirely into its labyrinth, to rewrite his mind and identity into its endless corridors. Every shadow that lunged, every whisper that screamed, every distorted reflection was a test, a probe, a challenge. And he understood, with a clarity born of desperation, that submission was the only thing that would ensure his permanent entrapment. He could not give in. Not now. Not ever. He forced himself to breathe, to anchor to a single truth: he was still himself. The house might shape the world, twist perception, and warp memory, but it could not touch the essence of who he truly was if he refused to surrender. With every ounce of concentration, he centered himself, letting the pulse of the core wash over him without consuming him, letting the chaos swirl while he remained anchored in his own consciousness. The shadows recoiled slightly, the whispers faltered, as if surprised by the force of his will. The core shuddered, ripples of darkness and light pulsing outward like waves of psychic energy. David's reflection in the fractured surfaces of the chamber multiplied into countless versions, each screaming, crying, or mocking him. Yet he refused to look at them, refusing to be manipulated by the house's illusions. He focused on the center of the core, reaching deeper into its writhing mass, probing for a weakness, a flaw, anything that could give him leverage. And he found it, a subtle hesitation, a slight lag in the pulsation, the tiniest fissure in the house's perfect rhythm. Seizing the opportunity, David pressed further into the core, merging his focus with its energy. The chamber shook violently, the shadows howling in protest as the house recognized the challenge, its will colliding with his own in a psychic storm. Memories and fears surged against him, pressing, clawing, attempting to bend him, but he resisted, holding fast to the truth of his identity. The air cracked and split with the intensity of their confrontation, the core convulsing like a living thing caught in agony. Then, in an instant, everything froze. The shadows halted mid-motion, the whispers silenced, the reflections suspended. David stood at the center of the core, chest heaving, mind straining, and for the first time, he realized he was not entirely trapped. The house had a limit. Its consciousness was vast, intelligent, terrifying, but it relied on fear and submission to function. And he had refused. The realization gave him a fragile hope. If he could push further, confront it fully, he might reclaim his freedom. With trembling hands, David reached deeper into the core, forcing himself to merge willpower with presence, challenging the house not with fear, but with defiance. The shadows surged violently one last time, the whispers rose into a deafening crescendo, and then, in a sudden, violent release, the core shattered. Light and shadow exploded outward, warping reality, collapsing corridors, and forcing every distortion back into the void from which it had emerged. The house shrieked, not with sound, but with psychic resonance, a final cry of rage as its dominion over David faltered. David collapsed to the reflective floor, gasping, sweat and blood mingling, his mind trembling at the intensity of what had occurred. Around him, the chamber began to dissolve, walls fading into darkness, shadows retreating, the impossible spaces folding into themselves. And in that profound silence, he realized something terrifying and exhilarating. The house had been waiting for him, shaping itself around him for decades, but he had survived. He had confronted the impossible, faced his deepest fears, and resisted total annihilation. David remained on the reflective floor, chest heaving, eyes wide and unblinking. The chamber around him, once a living nightmare of shadows, warped hallways, and whispering voices, was dissolving into nothingness. The pulsating core, the epicenter of the house's power, lay shattered at his feet, radiating faint tendrils of light that dissolved into the air like smoke. For a moment, silence reigned. The oppressive weight that had pressed upon his mind for what felt like years lifted, leaving him dizzy, disoriented, yet alive. He staggered to his feet, every muscle trembling, aware that this fragile calm was not guaranteed to last. He walked forward cautiously, and the impossibly tall walls of the chamber began to ripple, folding inward and collapsing, revealing a familiar doorway, one he recognized from his childhood home, before the house had become a labyrinth of terror. Sunlight streamed faintly through the frame, and for the first time, David felt the warmth of something real, something unmanipulated. He stepped through, and the oppressive air that had suffocated him for so long seemed to lighten. Yet the house, though shattered, was not entirely gone. It lingered, like smoke in a room long after the fire has burned out, whispering faintly at the edges of his perception, "You cannot leave, not fully." David emerged into what appeared to be his childhood living room. It was pristine, untouched by the warped horrors he had endured. The walls were the pale cream he remembered, photographs hung neatly on the mantel, and the furniture seemed solid, familiar. He approached a mirror on the wall, expecting to see the twisted versions of himself, reflections warped by fear, but his own face stared back, exhausted, battered, yet undeniably real. Relief surged through him, yet a nagging unease clung to his mind. He knew the house had not been destroyed in the conventional sense, it had been outwitted, resisted, but it lingered in corners of perception, always watching, always patient. As he explored the room, David realized that the house's influence had not entirely faded. Subtle distortions remained, a shadow that lingered too long, a floorboard that creaked in impossible rhythm, a whisper in the air he could not locate. Yet despite these reminders, he understood a profound truth: the house had required him to confront himself, to meet his own fear and will with equal force. It had tested every memory, every regret, every ounce of courage within him, and by surviving, he had reclaimed his reality. Then, something moved at the edge of his vision, a small, deliberate motion that made his stomach twist. A figure emerged from the corner of the room, a mirror of himself, but older, hollow-eyed, and smirking. The reflection's lips moved, not in words, but in thought, conveying a single, chilling message: "You have survived, but the house waits." David froze. Though the house's core had been shattered, it had created a lingering echo of itself, an awareness that could persist, patient and intelligent, waiting for the next opportunity, the next confrontation. Survival had been only the first battle, vigilance would be eternal. David turned away from the reflection, his legs weak, body trembling, but his resolve unbroken. He moved toward the front door of the childhood home, the world outside, the sunlight beyond, freedom itself, and hesitated only for a heartbeat before stepping through. The air smelled of grass, earth, and life. He breathed deeply, feeling reality anchor itself around him, solid and tangible. Yet behind him, the faintest whisper tickled his mind, an echo of what he had faced. We are patient, we are waiting. For a moment, the house seemed to vanish entirely, leaving only memory and a lingering unease. David realized that his survival was not a triumph of brute force, nor of simple escape. It was a triumph of will, of understanding the nature of fear, of refusing to surrender to the entity that had shaped itself around him. Yet the knowledge remained, undeniable and haunting: the house waits for everyone. And for those who encounter it, it never truly lets go. David stepped into the sunlight, the world beyond the house vivid, real, and alive. Yet in the back of his mind, the house's echo persisted. He would carry it with him forever, a shadow at the edges of thought, a reminder that some structures are never built for us, they are built to test us, trap us, and shape us. And sometimes, they are patient enough to wait a lifetime for the moment we return. The house waits.